After this, we must consider the ways in which those who follow voluntary poverty must live. And indeed, the first method, namely that all may live in common on the price of the property sold, is sufficient, but not for a long time. And therefore the apostles instituted this mode of living for the faithful in Jerusalem, because they foresaw by the Holy Spirit that they would not have to stay together in Jerusalem for long, both because of the persecutions to come from the Jews, and also because of the imminent destruction of the city and the nation. So it was only necessary for the faithful for a short time to provide. And for this reason, passing over to the nations in which the church was to be established and perpetuated, they are not read to have instituted this way of life. But there is no fraud against this way of life which can be committed by the stewards. For this is common in every way of life in which some people live together, but in this the less, the more difficult it seems to happen, that in pursuing the perfection of life, they commit fraud. A remedy is also used against this by providing for the appointment of faithful stewards, whence Stephen and others were chosen among the apostles, who were considered fit for this office. Now there is also a second way of living suitable to those who assume voluntary poverty, namely, to live on common possessions. Nor by this means is anything lost in the perfection to which those who assume voluntary poverty tend. For it can be done by the care of one or a few of them that possessions are properly procured, and thus the others, remaining free from the care of temporal things, can freely devote themselves to spiritual things, which is the fruit of voluntary poverty. And even those who assume this care for others lose nothing of the perfection of life. For what they seem to lose in the want of rest, they recover in the obedience of charity, in which also the perfection of life consists. Nor even by this mode of living is the harmony taken away by the occasion of common possessions. For those who despise temporal things must assume voluntary poverty, and such cannot disagree for temporal commons, especially since they should expect nothing but the necessities of life from the temporal, and when stewards ought to be faithful. Nor can this mode of life be disapproved of, because some people are abused in this way of living. For even the good are used badly by the bad, just as the good use the bad for good. A third mode of living also suits those who assume voluntary poverty, namely, to live by the labor of their hands. For it is not in vain to let temporal things go, that they may be acquired again by the labor of the hands, as the first reason proposed to the contrary, because they required the possession of riches and care in obtaining them, or at least guarding them, and attracted the affections of man to themselves, which does not happen while a man endeavors to obtain his daily subsistence by the labor of his hands. Now it is clear that in order to acquire by the labor of the hands a livelihood sufficient for the maintenance of nature, a little time suffices, and a little care is necessary. But to amass riches, or to obtain a surplus livelihood by the labor of the hands, as the worldly artisans aim, it is necessary to spend much time and to exercise great care, in which is clear the solution of the second reason. But we must consider that in the gospel the Lord did not forbid work, but mental concern for the necessities of life. For he did not say, "Do not labor, but do not be anxious," which is proved by the minor. For if by divine providence birds and lilies are supported, which are of a lower condition, and cannot labor in those works by which men earn their living, he will provide much more for men who are of a more dignified condition, and to whom he has given the ability to seek livelihood by their own labors. so that he need not be afflicted with anxious anxiety about the necessities of this life. Hence it is clear that by the words of the Lord which were introduced, this way of living is not derogated from. Nor can this way of life be condemned because it is not sufficient. Because this happens to a few, that a person is not able to acquire enough by the labor of his hands that suffices for the necessary subsistence, either because of infirmity or because of something of the sort. Now, because of the defect which occurs in the few, no order is to be rejected, for this happens both in natural and involuntary orders, nor is there any way of living by which a man is so provided for that he may sometimes fail. For riches may also be taken away by theft or robbery, just as he who lives by the labor of his hands may be weakened. There remains, however, some remedy in regard to the aforesaid manner of living, namely, that he whose labor is not sufficient for his own subsistence may be assisted either by others of the same society, who can work more than is necessary for them, or even by those who possess riches, according to the law of natural charity and friendship, by which one man helps another in need. Whence also, when the apostle had said, 2 Thessalonians 3:10, he who does not want to work will not eat, for the sake of those who do not have enough for themselves to earn their living by their own labor. He adds an admonition to others, saying, but you do not fail in doing good. Since even a little is sufficient for the necessary subsistence, it is not necessary for those who are content with a little to occupy a great deal of time in seeking the necessities with the labor of their hands, and so they are not hindered much from other spiritual works, for which they have assumed voluntary poverty, and especially when, by working with their hands, they can think of God and praise Him, and do other things of the like which they ought to observe singularly for themselves. But in order not to be hindered at all in spiritual works, they can also be helped by the blessings of other believers. But it is true that voluntary poverty is not assumed for the sake of removing idleness or soaking the flesh with manual labor, because even those possessing riches could do this. There is no doubt, however, that manual labor is useful for the aforesaid, even under the necessity of sustenance. However, leisure can be taken away by other, more useful occupations, and the lust of the flesh can be tamed by stronger remedies. Hence, for reasons of this kind, the necessity of labor is not imminent for those who have, or can have, other means by which they can legally live. For the mere necessity of sustenance compels one to work with the hands, whence also the apostle says, 2 Thessalonians 3:10, he who does not want to work will not eat. A fourth way of life concerning what is brought about by others is suitable for those who assume voluntary poverty. For this is not unreasonable, that he who has let go of his own for something which tends to the advantage of others should be supported by what is given by others. For unless this were the case, human society would not be able to continue. It is therefore appropriate for human society that those who, neglecting their own concerns, serve the common interest, should be supported by those whose interest they serve. But those who assume voluntary poverty in order to follow Christ, certainly for this purpose leave everything to serve the common good, enlightening the people with wisdom and learning and examples, or supporting them with prayer and intercession. From this also it is clear that they do not live shamefully on what is given to them by others, from which they themselves repay greater things, receiving temporal support, and advancing others in spiritual things. Hence the apostle also says, 2 Corinthians 8:14, let your abundance, that is in temporal things, supply their want in the same, so that their abundance, that is in spiritual things, may be a supply for your want. For he who helps another becomes a partaker of his work, both in good and in bad. And while they provoke others to virtue by their examples, it happens that those who prosper by their examples are less affected by riches, while they see others abandoning riches entirely for the sake of the perfection of life. And the less a man loves riches and is more intent on virtue, the more easily he distributes his wealth to the needs of others. Hence those who, assuming voluntary poverty, live on what is given to them by others, become more useful to other poor people by inciting others to works of mercy by words and examples, than they become harmed by receiving benefits for the maintenance of the lives of others. It is also clear that men perfect in virtue, such as they must be who pursue voluntary poverty, despising riches, do not lose their freedom of mind because of some little things which they receive from others for the maintenance of life. Whereas a man does not lose his freedom of mind except because of those things which dominate his affections. Hence, because of those things which a man despises, if they are given to him, he does not lose his liberty. And although the support of those who live on what is given by others depends on the will of the givers, it is not for this reason insufficient to support the life of Christ's poor. For it does not depend on the will of one, but on the will of many. Now, it is not probable that in the multitude of faithful people there are not many who readily assist the needs of those whom they hold in reverence, because of the perfection of virtue. But it is not inappropriate if they also explain their needs and ask for necessities, either for others or for themselves. For the apostles are read to have done this, not only by taking necessities from those to whom they preached, which was more of power than of begging, because of the Lord's ordination that those who serve the gospel should live by the gospel, but also for the poor who were in Jerusalem, who, having sent away their own, lived in poverty, and yet did not preach to the Gentiles, but their spiritual conversation could be of value to those by whom they were supported. Wherefore the apostle persuades such, not out of necessity, but out of the will of those who give, to help in alms, for there is nothing else but to beg. But this begging does not render men contemptible if it is done in moderation, to necessity, not to excess, and without importunity, considering the condition of the persons from whom it is requested, and of the place and time, which must be observed by those who pursue the perfection of life. From this it is also clear that such begging does not have any appearance of disgrace. How would it be if it were done with intrusiveness and indiscretion, for pleasure or excess? It is clear that begging is associated with a certain rejection. For just as it is more ignoble to suffer than to act, so to receive than to give, and to obey a king than to govern and command, although on account of something connected reparation may be made. But to assume voluntarily those things which are objection belongs to humility, not indeed simply, but according to what is necessary. For since humility is a virtue, nothing works indiscriminately. Therefore it is not humility but foolishness, if one assumes anything rejected. But if that which is necessary is done for the sake of virtue, one does not refuse because of rejection. For example, if charity demands that some neglected duty be paid to the neighbors, no one should refuse this through humility. If therefore it is necessary to pursue the perfection of a poor life that someone begs, it is humility to bear this rejection. And sometimes it is also discarded to assume virtue, even if our duty does not require it, that we challenge others by our example to whom it is incumbent, so that they can do it more easily. For even a leader sometimes performs the duty of a soldier to challenge others. And sometimes we also use the discarded according to virtue as a kind of medicine. For example, if someone's mind is prone to immoderate exuberance, he usefully kept under due control makes use of the aversions, either voluntarily or imposed by others, to suppress the elation of his mind, are busy, and sometimes we also use the discarded according to virtue as a kind of medicine. For example, if someone's mind is prone to immoderate exuberance, he usefully kept under due control makes use of the aversions, either voluntarily or imposed by others, to suppress the elation of his mind, are busy. And sometimes we also use the discarded according to virtue as a kind of medicine. For example, if someone's mind is prone to immoderate exuberance, he usefully kept under due control makes use of the aversions, either voluntarily or imposed by others, to suppress the elation of his mind, are busy. But it is a completely unreasonable error of those who think that all their concern is forbidden by the master in seeking food. For every act requires care. If, therefore, a man ought to have no anxiety about corporeal things, it follows that he ought not to do anything corporeal, which is neither possible nor reasonable to observe. For God has ordered the action of each thing according to the property of its nature. But man is composed of a spiritual and physical nature. It is therefore necessary, according to the divine ordination, that he should exercise both bodily activities and concentrate on spiritual ones. And he is so much more perfect the more he concentrates on spiritual ones. However, this is not the way of human perfection, that nothing bodily is done. He neglects his own life, which everyone is bound to preserve. But to expect help from God in those matters in which one can help oneself by one's own action without one's own action is foolish and tempts God. For this belongs to the divine goodness, so that he provides for things not by immediately doing everything, but by moving others to their own actions, as was shown above. Therefore it is not to be expected from God that, having omitted every action by which a man can help himself, God will help him. For this is contrary to the divine ordinance and to his goodness. But by moving others to their proper actions, as was shown above. Therefore it is not to be expected from God that, having omitted every action by which a man can help himself, God will help him. For this is contrary to the divine ordinance and to his goodness, but by moving others to their proper actions, as was shown above. Therefore it is not to be expected from God that, having omitted every action by which a man can help himself, God will help him. For this is contrary to the divine ordinance and to his goodness. But because, although it is in us to act, yet it is not in us that our actions should be destined to their due end, on account of the impediments which may befall them, this is subject to the divine disposition, what results from each one's own action. Therefore the Lord commands that we should not be anxious about what pertains to God, that is, about the results of our actions. But he did not prevent us from being anxious about what pertains to us, namely, about our work. He does not therefore act contrary to the commandment of the Lord, who is anxious about those things which are to be done by him. But he who is anxious about those things which may emerge, even if he himself carries out his own actions, in such a way that he omits the due actions to meet such events, against which we must in God's providence to hope, by which even birds and plants are supported. To have such concern, it seems to belong to the error of the Gentiles, who deny divine providence. Because of this, the Lord concludes that we should not worry about tomorrow, by which he did not prevent us from preserving those things which are necessary for us for the morrow in their time, but that we should not be anxious about future events with a certain despair of divine help, or that we should not preoccupy ourselves today with the anxiety that will be had tomorrow, because every day has its anxiety. Whence it is submitted, because every day has its anxiety. Whence it is submitted, because every day has its anxiety. Whence it is submitted, the day's malice is sufficient. It is therefore clear that those who pursue voluntary poverty can live in different suitable ways, among whom a person is so much more praiseworthy, the more he renders a man's mind immune from the cares of temporal things and the preoccupations about them.